reached out to Gretchen about a year ago when I decided to share my story, and I played an audio tape of when I was taping my podcast at Podcast One that had happened about 5 months prior to me sharing it. And the owner of Podcast One, Norm Pattis, I was doing a bra commercial. He came in, made me very nervous. It was all on tape. He knew we were taping. And I started to do I said, please, I just got to get through this commercial. I started to describe it, the bra. Oh, it's got memory foam here. And then he comes and he's like, hold on. I'm like, what? And he comes over and he's like, can I hold your breasts? Are these memory foam hands? They are to me. And I'm like, and that day I called and said, I don't want to do a podcast here anymore. And he made it very difficult for me to leave. And, but eventually I left. And then around November of last year, I think it was, after hearing the Donald Trump tapes and knowing about Gretchen and how brave she was, and seeing that the controversy that went to it before people were, not everybody was on your side, I said, you know what? I'm just going to play this tape. Because I'm a stand-up comic and I say R-rated words, can I be sexually harassed? I was like, I just wonder what people are going to think. So I just played it, and I go, what do you guys think? I've had this tape for a year, because I get every one of my podcasts. And the response was like, stuff I didn't even notice. They're like, the way your voice changed the minute he walked into the room, and it was overwhelming. And so then I tweeted you, and then you just started to do your book and asked me to be a part of the book, Be Fierce. And it's amazing. Your story is so inspiring. And then, of course, the last 2 weeks, I mean, let's just get started. I mean, what, you got through that.
Let me just say thank you to Heather for doing this tonight, first of all, and for having the courage to tell her own story, because that is part of the chain of inspiration. And the gift of courage, that's why I named my fund that, because I have found out that giving that gift of courage on these particular stories is contagious. And the more that we continue to pass that along, the more work we get done. And look where we are today. Just 15 months after I filed my lawsuit, this is the tipping point in our culture and our society. And the way in which news works so quickly, where we go from one story to the next and we have no attention span whatsoever, the idea that we're still talking about this every single day for the last 2 weeks, and more stories are coming out, I think that there's no turning back at this point. So thank you for your bravery in being part of that chain of inspiration.
Well, thank you. It was really freeing, because I was just like, but you know, at the time, I have to say, in my career, I didn't have that much to lose. I really didn't. Chelsea Lately had ended, and I was like, I'm just going to be overly honest in my podcast, and it did affect me. I had people that were friends of mine that was like, I don't know why you want to ruin this guy's career. And I'm like, what? It's not like I tricked him. I didn't have like a mic hidden around me. I mean, he knew what was happening. He didn't care. He'd gotten away with it for so long, for so many years. And because, you know, he's got Laker seats in a jet, he gets away with it. You know, the guy's still a UC regent, advising on sexual harassment in the classroom and stuff. I mean, it's crazy. And when I brought up the story, I had interviews done, and he hired a crisis team management, what do you call it, PR management team to squelch the story. So then I was like, yes, I'll be part of your book, and I'll keep saying it. And the result has been I cannot be a guest on any Podcast One show. I have personal friends that say, I'm so sorry, I can't have you on. You know, and so being banned, and that's a big part of not speaking up. And people don't realize, especially in entertainment and the news, these are few and far jobs to come to. They're very, even if it happened, it happens at every job, but I'm just saying, when you're like, oh my God, you had your own show, you know, you're a television personality, you had it happen quite a few times throughout your career. And I want you to tell the one story that was featured in the book as well as in the People magazine article. When you had the television exec want to meet you. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, so along the way in my life, after being a serious violinist as a child and then quitting much to the chagrin of my parents and going off to Stanford and Oxford to study My mom convinced me to enter the Miss America pageant, which was 50% of your points were based on talent. And so after working really hard to achieve that towards the end of my year as Miss America, I started becoming interested in getting into television. And so I cold called people, being tenacious and goal-oriented, and I got this executive in New York, and he decided to spend the whole day with me, and I sat in his office and he made all of these phone calls for me, and I was like, wow, this guy really wants to help me. And we went to dinner, and then we were in a car service going back to my friend's apartment, and all of a sudden he was on top of me with his tongue down my throat. And I was like, wow, I didn't realize this whole day of helping me meant that he wanted to also get into my pants. And it's just this incredible, demoralizing, automatic feeling when something like that happens to you, because all the self-confidence that you've built up in your whole life and that you think somebody really appreciates you for your brain and your talents just immediately drains out of you so fast. And I got to my friend's apartment and I just was a sobbing mess, you know, because you start asking yourself at 22, what did I do? Unfortunately, that's what we do. We question ourselves. And we didn't do anything. And that's the whole thing about this issue that we need to make sure that we clarify.
Right.
Sexual harassment is not something you and I did. It's something someone else did to us.
And I thought, yeah, it crushes your confidence, because when you said, here, I actually thought this guy really thought I was talented, I should be on shows, when now everything was because of that. And it's really, that's what it does when, you know, yes, that's how it really injures people, as you talk about. It just crushes people. And I know with the letters I've gotten, it's just story after story. And what was great about one of the stories I got is this girl said, I was listening to your podcast in the car about all of this stuff, and she's at a stoplight in Chicago, and a cab driver looks at her and does something very lewd with his tongue and his fingers, okay, at her face. And she's like, she's all freaked out, and she's like, you know, a week ago, I would have been shaking for 25 minutes, grossed out, kind of had my day ruined. She's like, but since listening to your podcast, I got the license plate, I called the cab company, and I reported him. And then she told me the cab number, and I said it on my podcast, and it was like, that's it. Like, why would you protect this gross guy? Why would you, you know, I understand, you know, but even, sometimes it's a job, but sometimes it's just someone acting horribly, and they've been able to do that gross thing to people for 20 years while he's driving the cab, and no one's ever reported it. And so by reporting it, you're stopping it from happening. I'm telling you, I'm sure that, I don't know if he lost his job, but I'm sure he's not doing that to people in Chicago anymore.
Right.
You know?
Well, and that's one of the biggest things to understand about this issue, is that sexual harassment is usually actually not about sex. It's about power. It's about, especially in the workplace, it's about somebody who's immensely insecure themselves, but may be in a position of power, making you feel horrible because they don't feel good about themselves. So that's what it's really about. And I think that, especially even with my case, when I filed my complaint, you know, people were very into, including the media, printing all the salacious details. And that's fine. But what was really undersold in my whole story was the retaliation that comes for women who face this type of behavior. And if you have the balls to complain about it, you know, then what? Then you stop getting the plum assignments, then you stop getting the good guests, then you get the old desk from the closet instead of the new $10 million studio, and then you know, sure enough, you get demoted, and after that, you get fired. And that's really the undersold, tantamount part of this entire issue, is the immense retaliation that goes into keeping that position of power when you don't acquiesce.
Well, it's like, you don't want to be a troublemaker. Why would I share that story? You know, he's powerful. And I remember, even with my story, I called Gloria Allred's office, and I just spoke to an attorney that was like on the floor. And I told her my story, and she's like,
well, you're not a full-time employee, you're an independent contractor, and if I were you, she's like, I would just try to do your podcast somewhere else. And I tried to explain that he was trying to keep me from doing it anywhere else. But I said, she's like, because I think this guy's really powerful and I think he could really hurt your career. That's what an attorney said, and numerous people told me that too. You don't want to look like you're a troublemaker. You've already had some things in the news about you being, difficult or whatever. And so it's, and that's why people stay silent. And, so what made it come to you finally? Because you had these other little things that, not little, but you'd had these different moments throughout your life that you talk about that you were a victim of sexual harassment and assault as far as the network guy goes. And so what made you finally decide to do this now?
Yeah, I mean, fast forward. So I had another incident actually here in Los Angeles where a high-ranking person in publicity, we were in a car again, unfortunately, and he took my head and my neck in his hand and forced my head into his crotch so hard I couldn't breathe. And I managed to escape from the car immediately. So I had those two incidents. Then in my first job, one of my first things was to cover the Anita Hill hearings. And I was working in Richmond, Virginia, and a week later I was sexually harassed on the job. The irony. And that time I was way out in rural Virginia covering a story, and when we got back into the car, the cameraman with me started talking to me about how I had enjoyed him touching my breasts when he put the microphone on me, and it went from there. This is before cell phones. And I actually visualized myself rolling out the passenger side door, going 50 miles an hour and wondering how much it would hurt, because I was so desperate to get away. And when I got back to the office, luckily, my male boss noticed me shaking like a leaf and kept coming to me and saying, what's wrong, what's wrong? And I kept saying, nothing, nothing, nothing. I mean, I was starting in my job, same thing.
Right.
Barely knew what I was doing in television, much less being sexually harassed. So eventually he convinced me to tell him. And this cameraman was let go for maybe that and other reasons a short time later. So after that, I had really good work environment situations. I had worked in Cincinnati and Cleveland and Dallas and CBS News in New York. And, and then I got to my last employer place, and it was, long standing. I will say this, because of course I signed a settlement, and this keeps women from ever telling their stories, which we can get into, which is a wrong way to try and resolve these things and shove them into secrecy. But what I can say is that when it became apparent to me that my time at a place with more than 25 years of experience and rising to the top of my profession, that it was going to come to an end for me, and not because I was choosing for it to come to an end. That I decided, if I don't do this, who will? And I looked into the faces of my children. My 14-year-old daughter is here today. And I thought to myself, I don't want her to face the same indignities that I've faced, and that millions of other women have faced, and some men. And I want to change it for the next generation. And that was when I decided to jump off the cliff by myself.
And I remember one day watching The View, and this really bothered me because they were talking about your case. And Jedediah was one of the hosts, and she had come from Fox News. And she said, well, all I know is that I've had a wonderful experience there, and it's been great for me, and blah, blah, blah. And then Joy Behar says, well, you're brunette, maybe he likes blondes. And I was like, what an idiotic, stupid thing to say. Because now you're objectifying women too. Like, oh, well, you just, oh, he has a type. No, the type is female, and I'm trying to be powerful, and I'm showing off my power. It has nothing to do, with your physical type is not his, or I don't know, it was bothersome.
Well, there's so many myths and stereotypes that come with this issue, which I lay out in the book. I mean, first and foremost, that women make it up. I've never met anyone over the last 15 months since my story broke who would, love to have their story out there if they were making it up. And by the way, studies show that, yes, there are some false allegations, but 96% of all cases end up being accurate. Number two, that women only do this for money and fame. Well, again, that couldn't be farther from the truth in the sense that look what you go through when you decide to come forward. One case that I think was so important over the summer was Taylor Swift in the groping case, because she's probably the most famous singer in the world, one of them, and the richest. So money and fame for her.
Explain that in case
Yeah.
some people may have missed it.
From what I remember is she said that this DJ groped her when he took a picture with her at one of her shows. And he ended up suing her, saying because she said that he lost his job. So then she countersued him for $1, and it was proven they believed her. So
Right.
the case was thrown out.
The case was thrown out. But
yeah.
she didn't have to do that. And I'm so glad she did, because she sent an incredibly great message about these myths about you do this for money and fame. She doesn't need either. And she sent an incredible message to millennials about what it means to stand up and speak up for who you are and the self-confidence and the person that you are. And even if it was just this small incident of being groped, she knew it was wrong. What are the other myths? Oh yeah, that you're a liar and that you are a troublemaker and you just can't take a joke, and we could go on and on and on with those. So this is why women don't come forward. I mean, if you add into the mix also that it's like companies go into like emergency mode whenever this happens to protect the harasser. It's unbelievable the lengths to which companies will go to make sure that the harasser can stay in the workplace, and let's just get rid of this woman. And that's what's happening.
Like this one girl wrote me about a story that happened at a bank that she worked at. And this guy, just like a priest gets moved from parish to parish back in the 1960s, this guy got moved from bank to bank to bank. It's like, are you that valuable? I mean, speaking of value, now the latest thing about Bill O'Reilly just came out, and that they paid out $32 million, and he still got to keep his job to people that...
that was one person.
That was just one person, but there were six different cases of sexual harassment against Bill O'Reilly in which it was proven to a point where they paid these women. So obviously, I believe that is true, but whatever. I mean, and I'm like, really? Is Bill O'Reilly that amazing? I mean, what the heck? Like, there isn't somebody else that can talk to people? Like, my God, look at me.
Well, the only thing I can say about that is that I think it's horrifying and outrageous that companies would knowingly re-sign contracts with employees. I mean, I'm not sure what that says about their value for women. And that they would invite people back to be on the air recently after knowing that. It's outrageous.
Let me see. Now this was pretty recent, so that you wrote this book. Was it emotional as you were writing it? Because I feel like just you making you tell the stories again, you're still like, it never goes away. You heard me, when I was telling my story just in the beginning, I was like shaky, and I don't get nervous. It's awful,
It's like a PTSD thing if you've ever been through this. I mean, so here's what I found out. Every woman still has a story, and that's tragic.
Yeah.
And what happened was, in fact, on the first day that I filed my suit, we heard from 6 women that day from 50 years ago with the same person. And then it just started mushrooming where people started reaching out to me by the thousands. And my good Midwestern Minnesota upbringing, where my parents always taught me to write handwritten thank you notes and respond to people, made me respond to every single one of these women. And one of them is right here, Natalie Gossett. I recognize you. She was an amazing engineer here in California, and she's going through her own hell right now. And she was one of the first people that I wanted in the book because she's in the career of STEM. That's what we're trying to encourage girls to go into now, right? Science, technology, engineering, math. Here she was, so successful in her own right, and all that went poof because of some alleged random jerk. And so Natalie reached out to me, and so did thousands of other people, and what I realized was that this is an epidemic in this country, and that it's pervasive across every chosen career field, from waitresses to accountants to lawyers to teachers to members of our military. It's everywhere.
Well, I remember my friend, a good friend of mine, we had a couple jobs right out of school together out of USC, and then she got this job she loved in fashion, where she'd go, there was many different stores, and she would go to fly around and set up the new store. She loved it. And one day she went into the boss, these two brothers, very powerful, and she's tall, really tall, and the guy was like, came up to here to her. And he said, oh, you're wearing the new bodysuit. And she goes, and she had a blazer on. She goes, oh yeah, it looks good with this blazer. And before she even knew what happened, he'd grabbed her tit, like twisted it, and stuck his mouth, you know, his tongue down her throat. And she was like, huh, huh. And she left, and she called me crying, and she said, I love this job. And that's what people don't realize. When people say, oh, go find another job. You go find another job. It took her a long time to find a job she loved. She loved this job. She was really good at it. And she was like, oh my God, what's gonna happen now, you know? And fortunately, because she rejected him, he never called her to his office again, and she certainly didn't volunteer, and then like a year later, she moved on. But she thought about all the other women that did constantly go into his office, and one was a single mother, and she's like, I just wonder if they were forced to do stuff to keep that job,
right.
You know? And she, you know, was always terrified he would call her in again, but he didn't. And that's the thing, you know, unfortunately, these people, Harvey Weinstein or whatever, they didn't get rejected every single time. They wouldn't keep doing it for 30 years. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes they overwhelmed the girl, or sometimes she was so scared she went through with it, or sometimes it became a weird, strange relationship that then somewhat seemed consensual, but it really wasn't. And it's all weird, and because they wouldn't keep doing it. I mean, when you heard the tapes of Harvey Weinstein begging that girl to come into the room, please, just 5 minutes. I mean, what a sick person. He was so used to doing this, pleasuring himself in front of people and seeing a horrified girl's face. That was his thing.
Mm-hmm. It was the whole power sick trip, beyond power trip.
Yeah. When the
yeah.
news broke, for you, like when you saw the news going on, and here you, I mean, were you just, and every day, more and more and more. And it was interesting because when it first came out, Hollywood was very quiet, you know, because I think they were like, well, you know, he denied it. He says he's going to sue the New York Times, and you know, none of the talk show hosts talked about it that night because they probably might have a movie with the Weinsteins or whatever. Why are they not talking about it? Oh, because they think it's just going to go away, hush, hush. Then when they realized it wasn't going to go away, then it's like, oh, I am horrified. And then people are like, oh, you're horrified when I told you 12 years ago, and you know.
So this brings up a big part of what I write about in the book, about enablers and bystanders. I mean, let me just say this about the Weinstein story. The negative is that for 30 years, this man allegedly traumatized women. And the bigger issue to me that allowed it to continue was that enablers, colleagues, lawyers, assistants, they all helped in the cover-up. And they all helped in the shutting up of the victims. And that's outrageous.
They had to agree to keep silent before they ever took the job.
Well, and it was in his latest contract that the board allegedly also allowed him to continue to sexually harass, but if they found out about it, he had to pay back to the company a fine. Equally outrageous. The positive is that since my story broke, and then you had the Uber story in the Silicon Valley and others, and then you had this, it showed me that in a short period of time, for a cultural change, which usually takes forever, that we were making progress. And that any of the work that I've been doing for the last 15 months to raise awareness about this, that it was working, and that women felt more brave to put their name and their face to the issue. And I really believe that it is now a watershed moment. I don't believe that we can regress back into, you know, a past conversation, because now men are shuddering in their boots if they are harassers or they're in the fetal position. Mm-hmm. And women are saying, oh, I do have a voice. I've seen this person do it, and this person do it, and this person do it, and so I'm now going to speak up
Right.
as well. But we have to get these bystanders to become allies for us, which is my main point. Enablers and bystanders, usually men, but can be women in these situations too. We need you. One of the things I realized from the research in my book was that there were so many great men out there already wanting to help. Most men want safe work environments for women. And it ended up being the longest chapter in my book because there were so many great men out there already doing fantastic work. In my unscientific study of walking the streets of New York City, I have to tell you that more men actually stop me than women. And they want to shake my hand and they say, "Thank you for my daughters." So what I would love for them to do is join the Be Fierce movement now and also summon up the same amount of courage that the women have to face to come forward and be brave enough to say, "Don't ever say that ever again to her. That was the most disrespectful thing I've ever heard. Stops it cold."
And that's what I found with the people that wrote me, that there were a lot of male heroes, that was, could go up to her and, and say, "Hey, stop getting close to her in her cubicle. Stop," where people would just literally be trapped and someone's rubbing her shoulders or saying disgusting stuff to her every day. And then either a man saw it or they shared it with a male coworker, and a male saying to another male, like, "What's your freaking problem, you gross dude?" Like that, okay, it really makes a huge difference. So many of these people just were able to get away with it for so long and continue to be promoted. And so I think I have two boys that are 14 and 11, and I'm very confident that they will not be like this because we talk about it so openly. And but I also think for men, they don't understand it. Like I remember one time just watching one of the specials on all the Bill Cosby victims, and my husband's watching it and he's just horrified, and he's like, "That was me. I would have just walked right into the LAPD and I would have said," and I go, "And you're a 6'3" white male who's been 6'3" since you were 14, who's never been afraid you're going to be thrown into a van or kidnapped because of your physicality. And you're not a girl with 3 channels on TV that just got a guest role on the hottest show, and your own agent is telling you, well, you had a drink and you better just keep your mouth shut." So, that is why. And so that's the thing, no one can say what they would do in that situation because we're all different. I don't know what it's like, to be anything but a white woman who, grew up here and just like my husband, and that was like the first time he kind of got it. He was like, "Yeah, you're right. I guess, I'm like, and it was 25 years ago, and, these women were just trying, and they were horrified, and they were so excited to meet him.
But it took one person. One person finally came forward, and then the floodgates were open.
Which is so great, and then that was another thing, that when people made jokes of like, "Oh, really, they're not that good, this one's not that good looking," or so now you're telling your story, and then you also are getting picked apart that you're not hot enough.
Oh, please. I opened the book with all the tweets, just one little snapshot of my Twitter feed on any particular day. And, it's if you didn't already have thick skin, you'd shoot yourself because, it's so vile to see what people think they can tell you anonymously on social media. But the way in which I looked at it was like, wow, I have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
We have a lot of work to do, which I definitely want us to talk about too with regard to trying to change the laws.
Oh, yeah. So, when we were saying about Anita Hill, I felt like I remember being 11 during watching the Anita Hill trials on TV, like with my parents. And then,
thanks for aging me, by the way.
What?
Thanks for aging me.
Well, I don't know, was I 11? What year was it? I don't know. I just remember where I was in the kitchen. I don't know how old I was. But the point is, no, maybe I was older. I don't know. Maybe I was when was it? What year was it? Okay, I was not 11. Okay, sorry. I was 20. Okay. So, I don't know why I thought I was 11. I guess I was home for the summer or something. Anyway, but we watched it, and then of course, she did not prevail. He became on the Supreme Court, and then it just seemed like we never heard about it anymore. And it's because all the cases after that, they would do arbitration, right? So
Well,
explain
yeah.
it.
So what's happened is, and don't get a glaze factor here, because it can be something that people just overlook, because what's happened is that in employment contracts, arbitration clauses have become prevalent. So what is that? That means that if you find yourself in a dispute at work, that you have given up your Seventh Amendment right to an open jury process, and that any kind of a dispute will be resolved in arbitration. Now, the company will say that's a good thing because it happens quicker and it's cheaper for you, and no one has to find out about it. Except for the fact that in an issue like sexual harassment, a secret chamber is not the best placed and ultimate place to go, because you can never tell anyone what happened to you. And therefore, the company can just clean up all of its messes and leave the harasser in the position of power. You're fired, you go to arbitration, only 20% of the time does the employee win. The company almost always picks the arbitrator. You don't get the same amount of witnesses, depositions, and there are no appeals. So in the end, you file a claim, nobody knows whatever happened to you, you're more than likely fired, and you can never tell anyone anything. So what is this doing to our judicial process on this issue? It means that we have no precedents. We're taking it out of the court of law, so we have no precedent in the last 20 years to be able to go back and say, well, according to a case, in 1995, you know how they always do that when you argue before the Supreme Court? There is no precedent on sexual harassment now anymore, because it's all gone to this secret chamber. The other way in which we have, as a society, deemed correct to solve these issues is settlements, which is what I did, because I would have been forced into arbitration. My attorneys found a way to make my case public without doing that first. But settlements also gag the women. So I can never, my case is out there so you can go read about it on Google, but had that not happened, you would have never known anything about my case. So both ways are silencing women. So what I've been doing on Capitol Hill for the last year is trying to get rid of this secrecy. I know I'm not going to be successful in getting rid of arbitration clauses in general, nor am I asking for that. I'm just asking for baby steps. So this tends to be a Democratic issue where they're on my side on this. So I've been meeting privately with Republicans. And what I say to them is what I said earlier about my children and their wives and their nieces and their granddaughters. Do they want that to happen to anyone in their family? And when you approach it that way, the answer is always no. Okay, so then what can we do to make sure it doesn't? We need to take away this secrecy so that women know. Imagine the power pendulum within a company when it's no longer secret. Oh, maybe this person doesn't harass anymore, and this person suddenly has more of a voice. And what does that mean? This person now is public enough so that other people within the company also know this is going on, and they're like, wow, it happened to me too. So it really evens out that whole power dynamic, which is so much a part of this issue. I'm incredibly optimistic that I'm going to get this bill co-sponsored by a Democrat and a Republican. And nothing gets done on Capitol Hill right now. So wouldn't it be fantastic if we got this done for women? So this has become one of my 5 full-time jobs in the last year. And I'm really optimistic that this is going to happen. And the only way it's going to work is if it's bipartisan. So that's where we are on that, so stay tuned.
And so speaking of other jobs that you have, what's going on with your return to television? What are you working on anything? Are you hoping to do more? Because I was on your show.
I know.
And I remember they called me and they said, Gretchen really wants to have this, she wants a panel of just women on Fridays. She really wants to hear from, and so you've always been empowering women. And I sometimes wonder if, being that you were at the Fox network, where people have a certain vision of everyone that works on that network, was that almost difficult? Like did you not have everybody, did you have some people not on your side just because you were associated with a conservative network?
Yeah, of course. But I've always been a registered independent. So I actually believe all journalists should be independents, to be honest with you. Because there's so much talk about bias and fake news and all that. I just think that it would be, I mean, to each their own, but
Right.
I legitimately am an independent, but I think it's helpful to be that when you're a journalist. So I've been writing the book, and then I've been doing my work on Capitol Hill. I've been raising 2 preteen children. I started a fund called Gift of Courage that I financially support organizations that already exist to empower women and girls. Next month will be kicking off the Gretchen Carlson Leadership Initiative, which is a 9-city tour across the country, 3 days of workshops in each city for underserved women. Because the gnawing question that I got over the last 15 months that I didn't initially have an answer for was, how do you help a single mom working 2 or 3 jobs trying to make ends meet and she's being sexually harassed? And I didn't have an answer for that. So that is why I'm financially supporting this initiative. Women across the country will be able to come to these workshops for free and learn about how to get legal advice, learn about domestic violence, sexual harassment. When you're facing those 2 issues, you have no voice, or you feel like you don't. So I'm also going to encourage them to become civically and more politically involved to get their voice back. So we're kicking that off November 2nd through 4th in Dallas, Fort Worth. Then we're going up in January to Minneapolis, where I'm from. And then the next month we'll be in Charleston, South Carolina. Stay tuned for the other 6 cities following. So that, my plate's been really full with all of these things. I'm also working with an iconic Hollywood producer on a series, a television series right now that we can't announce exactly what it is, but it'll be out in the spring. And yes, I plan to go back to my profession, number 1, to prove that I can, and number 2, because I've worked my whole life. And I plan to continue being a role model for my children. I feel that makes me a better mom, actually.
And don't you feel like so much more free than you did 3 years ago? Like, isn't it just like really, I mean, I'm just thinking about you and your career, and like to just be, it was so traumatic, but now it must be so freeing that it's all out there, that you're not keeping anyone's secrets, including your own and those of the ones that hurt you. It's always like, why keep the secrets of those that hurt you? Why? And I know why people do it, but I hope people stop.
It has been a liberating experience. However, there would be no way that I could have ever predicted how this would have turned out. I mean, when I jumped that day, there was no safety net below me. I would have never been able to envision how everything played out, or that I'd be sitting here today talking with Heather McDonald in Los Angeles, having just written a book. I mean, there'd be no way I could have known that.
And did you, when you did come forward in your situation at work, did you know that did you just think you were the only one, or did you have any awareness that there were probably several other victims throughout this time?
Yeah, see, I can't get into that.
Okay, you can't, sorry. But I'm sorry if I asked the wrong question, but
I think people can make their own assumptions based on what happened.
Yeah. But I mean, that's also really, really brave. Now and you were saying about the profit from the book.
All the proceeds from the book go back to my Gift of Courage fund. I just feel it's imperative to put my money where my mouth is with regard to continuing my efforts to help empower women and girls and boys. There's a whole parenting chapter in the book because I feel it's crucial that we start with our young people and giving them the correct messaging about gender equality in the way in which we raise them. And I mean, I always have said that I actually worked more for my son than for my daughter, even though she's sitting here, and she knows what I mean by that. That I wanted him eventually to respect his female colleagues in the workplace in the same way in which he looks at me and respects me every day. And I really believe that it's actually more crucial that we raise our sons in that way than our daughters.
I do too, and with date rape and assault on college campuses and all these things that came forward, the birds and the bees talk shouldn't just be for the fathers. It's the moms have to tell their sons why you don't kiss someone that doesn't want to be kissed, what that does to a girl, why it's traumatizing for the rest of her life. And so I'm very open with my kids about it. And I think more and more women should be talking to their sons and raising men that will not do this and not be accused of it. It put I always tell, I say, we need to be teaching our sons, just like you wouldn't put your key in ignition if you were drunk. You should not be putting your penis in a girl when you're drunk for the first time with her at a call. Don't do it. Like, don't do it. I mean, because that's where, there's a lot of women that are now trying to defend their sons, and they're in a horrible position, and we don't really know what happened, but two people were super drunk, and so you don't have sex when you're super drunk. Just like you wouldn't drive a car. And that's what you have to teach your boys, because it is scary when I think about, kids going to college. But we're gonna open it up to the audience to ask questions. So we've got the mic right there, so you just raise your hand and he'll come to you.
Bring a microphone to anyone who has a question. Just a quick reminder, questions around here start with a W or an H and sometimes a D. They are typically short. There's no such thing as a two-part question, and only Heather gets to ask follow-up questions.
I just wanted to ask about the confidentiality clauses in settlement agreements in sexual harassment cases. If looking back, if there's anything that you would do differently in terms of negotiating the clause, the confidentiality clause that you had, and related to that, what advice would you give to a sexual harassment victim who's about to settle a case where the employer or the harasser wants to include a confidentiality clause?
So all settlements have confidentiality clauses because that's why they're, in return for paying you a settlement, they don't want you to be able to ever talk about it ever again. My case was relatively rare in the sense that I can talk about the issue. They didn't take that away from me. We argued for that. And they apologized to me, which never happens, ever. But had I not agreed to that, I would have been thrown into secret arbitration. And so both would have been secret, and that could have gone on for forever and ever. This is the conundrum that women find themselves in, that you go to one of two secret chambers. So as a society, we have to decide that we're going to resolve this differently and not silence the victims forever. Now, some women have broken those agreements. They didn't, even in my story, they came forward on my behalf and they broke their non-disclosure agreements. And they put themselves at legal risk that the companies could come after them to get the money back. But this is, unfortunately, 95% of all sexual harassment cases are settled in settlement agreements. That's the way it works right now, unfortunately. Was there a second part to your question? Even though we weren't going to have two parties? Okay.
Hi, I'm Connor. I just wanted to ask you, actually, from a legal standpoint, what can we as civilians do to bring light to the bill that you're trying to get passed?
Oh, thank you so much for asking. Call your members of Congress in the House and the Senate and say, have you heard about the work that Gretchen Carlson's trying to do? And sexual harassment's apolitical. And everyone should be concerned about it. Because this is what I've said to them in private quarters. When somebody decides to harass you, they don't ask you what political party you're in before they do it.
Exactly.
And the same can be said for the harassers. We've seen it. There are Republicans, Democrats, and everything in between, right? So this is not a divisive issue between parties. It's something that we should all be concerned about. So thank you. And by the way, more men call their members of Congress by far than women. So women, we need to have more voice. We need to feel compelled to also pick up the phone and have a voice, especially on this issue.
I have a question. What's happened, or what do you think will happen if you spill the what's happened to you before the arbitration? I mean, do you think if you let's say, hurry up and tell what's happened to you before arbitration? Obviously, nobody can do anything
so the way
to you.
arbitration works is that the company can file the claim on your behalf if they get wind that you're about to say something. That's the problem.
Before?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's not the victim deciding, oh, I think I'll file a claim with arbitration. It's that if the company gets wind that you're thinking about it, they will file you into an arbitration so fast. Why? Because they don't want it out. They don't want it out. I mean, it's a way in which lawyers and companies have probably thought, wow, this arbitration thing is so fantastic because all of our dirty laundry will never be heard about anything.
How do you feel about our harasser-in-chief and the role modeling that maybe men, but also women, are experiencing now?
So this is very personal for me because, first of all, I've known Donald Trump for 27 years. I'm not surprised that he became successful in politics because I watched him as a master marketer for his entire career. Having said that, it was very personal for me because he defended my perpetrator a week after my story broke. And then he, the Access Hollywood tape came out. So, what I feel is the most important lesson that I could tell my children was that, to me, human decency supersedes any political policy. And I don't really care what anyone's political policy is. That's not how you treat people. So that's how I feel about it.
Very good.
Any other questions?
On Wednesday in California, there was a senator who said she'd be introducing policies next year to eliminate the secrecy and sexual harassment settlements. And I think it was about a year and a half ago, Governor Brown introduced legislation that would cover volunteers and interns who don't necessarily have an employment contract with a company but are sexually harassed. So these are positive steps that are being taken. But there are people who are harassed who don't necessarily have a structure there that's a company, relationship. So what can they do to avoid litigating and to try and solve the issue? Because nobody wants to go to court. But what if you find yourself in a position where you're being sexually harassed, but you don't have any other option because you've tried to resolve the problem in a non-litigating fashion, and yet that doesn't seem to be working because you're not getting the support from the leadership within the place that you're trying to resolve the issue.
I know exactly what you're talking about because there are people that don't have a human resources department and all that. I mean, two things. What I say in chapter 4, which is my playbook, my 12-point plan for women to basically just take right out of the book and put it in your back pocket. Because this shows you how to go through the roadmap if you find yourself in this kind of situation. And the first thing is you need to call an attorney before you do anything else. And that would be my first advice for anyone who doesn't have HR too. Even for a 10-minute conversation to just see what your parameters are. Statute of limitations are different in every state, whether or not you can file a claim with the EEOC, which would be a federal claim, and not to get too much into the minutia, but you don't have a lot of time. New York has the widest statute of limitations, but I think it's 300 days in almost every other state. And that really hampers women because by the time you build up the courage to come forward, you may be out. The other side of that is that I actually am very progressive in the book about talking about how human resources may not be the right place to go to anyway. Because you have to remember who's paying the check. And if the perpetrator is the person writing the check, that's a huge conflict of interest. So even if you are in a big company and you have HR at your disposal, it may not be the best place to go. So I actually propose in the book that companies, big companies, should hire ombudsmen to come in and be independent contractors so that women would feel more comfortable coming forward to somebody independent rather than somebody who may have been a former assistant of the boss who's now working in HR. So also to increase bystander training, not just sexual harassment training, but encourage people through training to come forward. But the main thing is if you don't have HR, then you have to call a lawyer first. There are plenty of employment lawyers who will take calls without charging you to at least give you a 10-minute, fact check about where you might stand and what the law is in the state.
And also, that's one of the things I told my daughter going off to college. I said, if something happens to you or your friend, go to the real police. I do not feel confident in college students going to the campus police for sexual assault, date rape. It happened to a friend of mine at USC, and they talked her out of it because it was 25 years ago, but still it was PR. It's their school. They want to keep it inside. They want to they don't want the exposure, and you might not really get the protection that you deserve. But that's kind of the way I feel about what you were saying, that maybe HR isn't the place to go. You know the vibe of your place or not, and so I think that's really good advice. And I think it's the best time in the history of the world to come out and tell someone if it's happening, because people are going to take you 1,000 times more seriously than they would have a year ago.
And it's why I'm doing a college campus tour, actually. I forgot to mention that. Because I feel it's crucial to get to young people at that time before they get into the workplace. And also just to speak to men on college campuses for the same reasons that we were discussing earlier.
Our final question for the evening.
So, Gretchen, I think you've really touched on something that was brought up in the first question about the confidentiality agreements, and it's not just in the workplace, but we also see with the church and in schools that a lot of times you're within a structure, and as you're saying with HR, where there is no outside body like the legal court system to file a complaint because there's an arbitration clause that you've signed as an employee or a member of the church or school. Is that something that your bill could look at addressing? Because I think if you couched it so that an employment arbitration agreement was voided by a claim of sexual harassment so that a lawsuit could be filed, then you also really undercut the purpose of a confidentiality agreement, because in the complaint you get all the facts out.
Right.
So that becomes part of the public
No,
record.
it's a great point. I mean, I understand why companies want you to sign confidentiality agreements for business secrets and the like, but for these issues, it was never intended. And by the way, it was never intended for arbitration clauses to handle these kinds of issues either. It was for other kinds of minor business disputes so that we weren't clogging up the courts, because we all know about that, how clogged up the courts are. But it was never intended for discrimination cases and sexual harassment cases to be shoved into secret arbitration. It's just become convenient. But you're so right about the confidentiality. So yes, we're still working out all of the exact language. You can imagine how long that's going to take with members of Congress. But it is a great point. So thank you for bringing that up.
Well, with that wraps up our evening. Thank you,
Thank you.
Gretchen.
Thank you to
Heather.